Is anyone not ready?
Just give me a sec, yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
Everyone.
What?
Hi. You're not ready. We know.
I'm never ready.
It's all good. Just gonna make sure.
That's just the truth.
Now's everybody good. Sweet.
3 weeks ago, a drone struck Somalia, killing 150 people. Media reports are generated from a disembodied security apparatus that assumes 150 people killed were by drone were from Al-Shabaab domestic colonial drive to kill. Greenwald 16. The U.S. drones yesterday to drop on the Somalia, India, at least 150 people in Mohammed strikes easily claimed that 100 people killed without the terrorists from the military, but no evidence to support the assertion. Most U.S. media reports getting nothing more than quotes from U.S. officials within discussion of their accuracy. U.S. saying that 100 people killed up. We don't know who the article. We all know there are bad terrorists, military, and they know any other than people who government dropped bombs and incredibly masculine, incredibly uncommon. If another bomb practicing aggressively expanded the drone into war in Africa, killing unlikely to get attention. The U.S. doing visibility places like Somalia, implicit developing the life use is not something awarded to Somalia. Congress never declared war on Somalia. 2001 U.S. justified we were bomber if we want approached by the UN. But 2001 UN might have enacted the U.S. authorized targeting of Al-Qaeda affiliated forces, but Al-Shabaab don't exist without money and nothing to do with 9/11. This violence exists at large. The disembodied international politics is characterized by modes of violence where people are understood as ahistorical biopolitical aggressions, exempt from a world of agency. The body is removed from a central focus in security studies. Wilcox 15. The international politics characterized by the mode of violence, the construct the bodies and complex way of actions drawn that operated from the 1,000 miles away to destroy the building cause accidental slaughter. They killed tertiary deployment and language of the management that all security state percent of the body views suffering the actions the people derived from the violence understood only as bodies. A historical biopolitical aggression of members of the breathing suffering sociality of bodies are erased social security study lacks reflexivity. See the contribution of the large when we're ignored. Theory such bodies not in order to operate the manipulated process, no agency, no driven motivations of age. But the problem is not particular of instances of military presence, though it is rather the structural conditions that hinder any analysis on people and security politics. The question of for this debate is about the negation to a particular disembodied relationship to security. Anything else renders itself back to the national security politic that justifies military presence. Wilcox 15. The challenging theorizing what is key 7 not only exposing how bodies implicit in theories and hierarchical bodies are producing productive theories to understand how more of violence and the hierarchy expand on the body view the picture of the body biological the notions of agents the arising body recount the consequence of political violence on the move and organize the conceal bodies and all political weakness we suffer from the violence and security of divine topic the control of the military force of the field works so explain involves the US military the cure or kill for human bodies and explicitly and implicit security said not security and limited to the announcement the security said the constant human security plus the question the violence of the human bodies and the relation the security said the utilization of the individual the exonerous of analysis though these relations are produced through the schemas of intelligibility. This is how the security apparatus operates through a frame that source and removes certain bodies from the periphery. This is Butler report. This scheme is told to be tactically maintained the media with a strength of maintaining U.S. power with deciding whether the public recognizes reality or not. Show the violence of violence to the hook and frame internalized values. The desperation of the realization that the human suffering the frame and advice of the similar intervening they send on the dream machine that follows the truly main and killed U.S. monster refusal by the media stumbling for the footage later to every the perspective of the side of the maintained by the state parties. Picture to show the right vision for the descent of the public idea and hegemonic field representation self the image of the point of the balance self to be precarious. They could not show they not continue to discount the pictures on the but not let that name will not agree with them not move that we will not return that they are raised for the other we cannot representation of the card the face to face to speak something other than language the task in return of the human in the face something that might have prompted that effectively regular critique this creates a hierarchy of frames that mandates the gratuitous violence on the population negating their social distance even before their prior physical construction. But Lord 4 the hierarchy does self-relation summarize humanized relationships having this kind of differential relations what extent he is on my phone as a human naturally is coming to humanism to people who are single off harassment more than their phone number for years the more the one wants to get their bodies the notion of humanism matter whether entry the level but ontology finds them on the for the extreme the negative the life or even negating the utilization of the life or the infinite parent where the images the wording is terrorism war without any end will be justified self in relation to the spectral infinity the enemy. How do we understand the utilization to the dominant frame of human there? No, the humanization curse first this level this verifies the physical violence. Therefore, Chris and I defend an elimination of military presence in topically designated countries in Africa as an instance of social refusal. The 1AC is not a politics of process, but outcomes. Our refusal begins by constantly interrogating the research practice that produces outcomes such as bad or problematic military presence rather than assuming a simple reduction solves the impact. We affirm not a solution-based politic, but a problem-posing one. Our refusal to engage in the small tedious questions about the reduction refuses a particular starts by first asking what causes, but how is this made possible by the word what evaluates our analysis to the structural. This is Jackson and 15. The critical piece started suddenly by intellectual orientation, how to understand the first existing order question, the common concept, not knowledge about peace, and how is the epistemal order come to exist and characterized by the healthy acceptance, the acceptance of knowledge claims that continuously question, they interrogate how is the cause, what complicit, the problem of the theory, seek to solve knowledge, power, enemy connected, that knowledge may never be neutral, contrast to this scientific and neutral standpoint, critical, but characterized by the openly ethical norm of things like peace or social formation, continued by discord, whether deciding to describe a peaceful, reconciled, or violent, not a value for neither threat, waiting to be discovered through the scientific methods, processes that give their meaning through, and intellectual categories, narrative including measure by which the science can be rated measurements or inherently ideologically prior to the violence of the structural minds, social concept, and art, contestation, the decorum, materiality, conceptualization, shaping each other, dialect, and everything, rather than one is solely constituted by the other piece, conflict, violence, reconciliation, constituted by the social, political, narrative, or the practice of violence, conflict not being understood, not powerful, the fire, without making it possible, and constant with the process of world by plain normative, structural, like, identities, and the truth, and what's of social action knowledge is a social party not including the life of knowledge, and the hopeful insecurity it results, the continuous critical reflexive recognize subjectivity, acts not to know the dangerous claim that recognize knowledge or the objective, and the until the whole cell rejection of objectivity, but there are multiple ways of knowing about the piece and the sanction or mere proofs, the best common process continuing to sensation of rather sense that the totality should be aimed, the aim plays some movements of the contestant, no illusion, no spoilers, the new book piece building, eventually claims not video, delegitimize the struggle support the externally, in post solution critical scholarship committed to the trying to overcome your study or of patriarchal forms knowledge prevalently, with NIR critical scholarship taking subjectivity here, this may refute the neurologic and normative social scientific explanation of the notions of cause and adopting into the logic of understanding how possible they rather than a cause question of the spatial subjective perspectives, effective forms of understanding foreclosed by traditional forms of science that may recognize the vulnerability of errors, way of constructing the nerves, which means to direct social structural violence possible by the structural critical approach to involve shift from the state central system to ability to a freedom well-being of human individual and doing some benefit of neutrality, the neutral state and efficiency, the power and difference, and then remind that first the press that these are taken seriously, and engaging policy takers listen to the theoretical option they assess that come into the human security, the state security, minimize question of all forms of violence can do name and negativity, possibly change one existing creation of the beacon, the recommend name makes a very critical scholars media man trying to construct the critical utopia kind of the struggle of the kind of concrete and point of educating function to facilitate conforming other transformation, several problem solving education, beyond the problems posed, use education, the students are deconstruct ideology by finding students with accessible tools to understand the problem, part with the developing appropriate minors of resistance pedagogy inherently backs ideological. We cannot begin from the position of reduction but refusal. The role of the judge as an ethical educator in the context of human geographies. This requires an acceptance of that refuses to make the liberal move to action in favor of interrogation and orientation. This is W11. Peace and people think bound with the opposite word. This is the caves given by the chain of political reward. The liberals no voice violent practice think of its outside the elimination political alternative the dramatic transformation of human affairs down where the peaceful geography look at the non-violence global transformation of the changing landscape global violence the geopolitical shift the way they incorporate a new way thinking where a peace non-violence will the conditions they can very well for the water social views or oppression the violence they have to constrain life for the discipline to certain things peace they link to the process with these belts the origin political transformation of and political politics the powers the powers with the great power worth the specification full focus on the state that are matter of external leadership Pacific past politics the depends on the piece of the more nuanced the geographical imagining quality the geopolitics the problem the danger the philosophy the preparation of violence representing the threats this rule is really some of the ability of our critical brains the symbol and the logical of class relying on invocation and ability remains crucial to nature binary situation the peaceful and lover those around the world of human institute of non-violent strategy to be satisfied by the reconstructing and violent transformation of the study neoliberal position puts us in social rule for the logical how the piece of vote opposed on the imperial peace negative piece about preventing conflict non-violence about political strategy to the violence to challenge the culture the violence that feel the use of power and all the coercion the rule the social political the life of the shaping institute that should benefit the U.S. economy prioritizing large-scale events ignores the body focus in favor of waiting for that violence in favor of existential calculus and ethical bankrupt and causes a laundry list of impact Olson 15 the large scale of free trade and moral reason the the body might pass because the already told to worry about the urgency this hope they say the economy requires neutral temporal orders for the something not be urgent we cannot the exclude from the potential collectivity that may suffer the from the future time the urgent body that serve for the tactical playing these building by his action of the large scale the emergency global factor the emergency the urgent institution risk of wins in body priority emergency the urgent body becomes the nonsense waiting on the producer hierarchies into those who wouldn't matter they do not waiting on waiting demobilize radical reform the ability political insecurity possibility to represent the delaying to a future one waiting on the normal possibility of the self-favorable way can be a function of the technology that the mobilizing and rating claims of the more urgency that comes of human value reclaiming the urgency for the body the urgent body that taking from hidden from the urgent body which counter the violence of power value political mundane is deeply political public sexual bloody essential suffering in the body when I would cannot wait with the ethical code affect wrong in the consideration alongside with the scope of large scale future 30 years suggesting a very total bias of the free urgency of large scale future work that was further describing the urgency of the body this just justifies the production of the new waiting process like detention there no more reasoning because it exposed norm devising and subject people provides the rational struggle the same people will require debate about those being is being saved not going to require for the debate wow what cannot weigh the close urgency will to be certain the be supervision responsibility may be fertile ground for the radical critique this does not require a shift from subjectivity but a shift from the subject and when he sees refusal of disembodied security apparatus displaces human from the embodied frame of Western man that not only institutes social life but also refuses the struggle to displace forms of violence Winter 03 the struggle for human whether become imperative of the current well-being of the world person as no class can serve on the man and the human and the man and the welfare represents the human itself being overserved the well-being therefore the full cunning behavioral autonomy the human species itself ourselves because of over-representation of human being in this unsettled coloniality of power the will and settling over-representation of the basic for the one modern all the professional respect class racial and sexual orientation ethnicity struggles of the environment the global warming this area common chain the sharp and no equal just reproduce our first resource of all differentiation, and class man versus human struggle, the struggle that usually excluded from the visibility situation, the category, the new world from the important, the fundamental level of refugee, economic migrants over the channel from outside the gates of their compulsion, awareness, the non category, the lost times of the struggle of our times, who wonder, the struggle of the overrepresentation of the central overrepresentation of reality, woman, one empirical human world, whole to continue parallel, supporting this new globally, modern class world of man.
You ready?
Yeah.
Alright. The 1AC. What about the 1AC defending a social refusal doesn't assume a simple reduction?
Yeah, so we're not going to defend like fiat or an example of that reduction.
Yeah, clearly.
We're a refusal of that like form of politics of problem solution, but
So,
rather
like,
we're
yeah.
a problem
Our
posing.
argument presumes that reduction, the resolution has approached reduction wrong, as in though it operates in a very benign sense, i.e. we reduce something and then we're good. The Jackson
Cool.
evidence
So
impact
gut
turns
check.
this
What
by...
do you actually do?
Yeah, we changed
What?
the way
What
like
do
the
you actually do?
yeah, we're a critique of the research apparatus. So in the status quo, there's like certain forms of
critique of
research that is
research.
disembodied from the way that we relate to things. So the Greenwald evidence talks about how whenever we were able to commit drone strikes on other populations, we didn't know if those actually were terrorists or not, but we decided they were. It's that research apparatus.
We have produced a research strategy that allows us as both educators and pedagogical agents to reshape our relationship to exterior
So you have
populations. The
agency?
Jackson
You're an
evidence says
agent?
what?
You're an agent?
We say that everyone
We'll
here is
defend
an
everyone's
agent,
agent.
You're an agent?
Yes,
Oh,
we'll
lit.
defend that.
Cool. What is the body?
The body. So like in the context of the 1AC, we talk about like different forms of bodies. Can you be more specific? I don't know what.
What do you define as
We think the body is
body
an
is
intricate site for
like
analysis whereby we
biological?
can't have a holistic definition, but rather an intricate
Yeah.
understanding. That's our Greenwald critique of the way in which
That was
disembodiment
like a
occurs now.
fancy way
That
of
does not mean...
answering the
Okay.
question, what is the body?
Well, if you were to define the body as being the same monolithically, that would be disembodied from different examples. So
Your
we're not going to
evidence
answer your question
clearly takes a
monolithically.
stance on what the body is.
I'm not
Yeah,
going to take
as
a
a
monolithic
critique.
like stance on
What's
this.
the difference or the relationship between subject and subjectivity?
What's
Yeah,
that?
so subjects are ones that are able to enact a form of subjectivity. I don't know what your like
I'm trying
Distinction
to
is-
figure how is it possible to like
be a subject.
shift from the subject without removal from subjectivity?
Like I think that's one and the same. I don't get the argument.
Right, so so the way you've power tagged this Winter's evidence is this does not require a shift from subjectivity, but a shift from the subject. I'm trying to like understand what.
Oh, we have made an argument that subjectivity is an inevitable facet of civil society, and rather the way in which subjecthood is
So I guess what is
articulated now.
subjectivity then?
Yes, we say at the beginning of cross-sex that we are all agents, i.e.
No, I asked
subjectivity
what
is
is subjectivity?
subjectivity is the ability to exist within civil society. Or our
Just
argument is that
existence?
current
Or not
subject
exist, but have social
articulation is
life.
problematic.
Alright,
Cool. Alright, so if the relationship between the slave and the massa is antagonistic, then can't the master still like grieve the slave as a mode of property?
We don't talk about grieving. I'm confused.
You won't?
We
So
don't-
what is
No,
Butler?
dude,
what I see
this
has
isn't the
nothing to do-
Butler Act from which
I'm just saying, so
This is
I
the same
guess what is your
affidavit.
defense of Butler then?
Our defense of Butler is talking about frames, so the ways that narratives has imposed a certain way of looking at the world.
Right.
We're not talking
So
about
what
Butler.
narrative
as-
should we implement?
Our
We're
argument
not-
isn't about implementing narratives.
not
Our argument is
implementing
creating
narratives.
a
It's not a
research
narrative.
strategy. The Butler evidence says that there are narratives that exist, but they exist in frames. The Jackson evidence says the way we discontinue our relationship
so
with
what
those
is the-
frames. What? Okay, what?
That's fine, that's fine. Okay, I
Okay.
guess. Sure. Who are populations?
Who are populations?
we'll defend that people in the room are part of populations. Like we're gonna defend.
Say
You have
what
social life.
population?
You're gonna say the opposite. That's what this debate's gonna be.
I'm just emailing. Alright, let me know if everyone got it.
You still need that first card?
I'll grab this stuff.
Just for flowing purposes, the first card on the dock is the first thing I'll read. The rest is paper, then I'll jump back to what's in the dock.
Should I float on a separate sheet, or
No, it's all.
this whole thing can just happen on one page?
Yep.
Sweet.
That's tight because ASU gave me 2 sheets. I'll just title this flow the debate.
Alright, everyone good?
The telos objective vertigo makes it impossible for our ethical action within the matrix civil society solution. The 11th subject of vertigo is distinct synthesis 1 is moving or spinning an otherwise stationary world, but the sensation is not one simply spinning an otherwise stable environment, and one's environment is perpetually unhinged ends. From objective vertigo, a life constituted by disorientation rather than a life interrupted by disorientation. This is structural as opposed to performative blind violence. Black subjectivity is a crossroads where verticals meet the intersection of performative structural violence. Black people's assumption by violence is paradigmatic necessity, not just for performative contingent to be constituted and disciplined by violence to be grid simultaneous by subjective objective vertigo is indicative of political ontology, but radically different from the political ontology of sentient being who's constituted by discord, discipline, and violence. So here she breaks with religious discourse to co-human revolutionaries. So subjective vertigo when they meet the state's disciplinary violence with revolutionary violence is subaltern, but their spirit objective vertigo. This is because the most disorientating aspects of their lives are induced by the struggles that arise from inter-human conflicts over competing conceptual frames, disputed cognitive maps, such as the American Indian movements, demand for the return of territorial efforts to U.S. desire to maintain territorial integrity of force, Armada de Liberación Nacional, demand for Puerto Rican independence versus U.S. desire to maintain Puerto Rico as a territory, but for the black, for the slave, there are no cognitive maps, no conceptual frameworks, suffering dispossession, which analogic within the myriads of maps and frameworks which explain the dispossession of human subalterns in the one he sees. Vivid description of inclusion only proves we live in a political academia world in which radical discourse only amounts to nothing more than a passionate dream of civic and social performance ability, never resulting in analysis of antagonistic structure and anti-blackness that is fixated on experience. My myriad identities that make up the structure positions Wilderson says the seemingly benign process attempts to hide rather than make known. The murmur suffering that covers the U.S. and the structural antagonism intensifies. It covers the ontological death of the slave. Its intellectual and political discourse and academia continues to resist the unreconcilable demands of blackness. Wilderson 10. Black slavery is foundational to modern humanism's ontic freedom is the hub of humanism's infinite conceptual trajectories finite, and that they are predicated on the idea of freedom from some contingency that can be gained. Contingent right could be freedom from patriarchal freedom, from economic exploitation, freedom from political tyranny, heteronormativity, and so on. Political discourse. Black slavery is foundational to modern humanism. Political discourse recognizes freedom as a structure and ontologically works to disavow by imagining freedom not through a political ontology but through a political experience and practice, whereupon immediately loses its ontological foundations, allowing the notion of freedom to attain ethical purity of its ontological status. One will have to lose one's human coordinates and become black, and we must dance with death to create a program of incoherence and avoid co-option. Anything short of radical negativity is bullshit. Wilderson 10. If the structural political desire helps to stake an antagonistic relationship between streaming and idiom and power that underwrites civil society, should rest the invitation to assume the positionality of object of social debt. We must admit that the Negro has been inviting whites and whites to civil society's union partners to justice debt for hundreds of years. Institutions have refused to learn to step the periods ago until oppression of the Black Panther Party and the BLA was a period in the flowering political power of blackness as demand capable of authorizing white radicalism. Black liberation makes radicalism more dangerous to the U.S. Because of the possibility of because its condition of possibility as well as gesture positions functions both politics refuse to affirm it as a function as a program of complete disorder in the black body is only says society social debt prior to time become dead by a 700-year injunction barring subjectivity. Social death is a condition of existence, not some avoidable impact. How we relate to this condition is all that is important. This is why you need to dance with that Wilderson. And 2. Civil society is not a terrain intended for the black subject. Structurally impossible position is a paradox of the black subject slave is vital to the political economy. He or she kickstarts capital at its genesis and rescues it from its overaccumulation crisis status and declinization is obviously a program of complete disorder. We must then accept the fact no other body functions in the imaginary as a reference story. Complete disorder is the black body, black society, absolute dereliction from its magnetizing bullets. The black body functions in the map gratuitous violence through which civil society is possible. Blackness is the side of absolute dereliction. Whoever says rape says black, whoever says prison says black. The Negro is a phobogenic object. This realization is a cause for enormous social movements may neither be social democratic nor Marxist in terms of structures. Political desire should grasp the invitation to assume the positionality of the subject of social death. The Negro has been inviting whites as well as the whites to civil society's union partners to dance to death for 100 years, but few have wanted to learn to accept this. Not to say that all oppositional political desire today is pro-white, but it is to say it's almost always anti-black, which is say will not dance for deaf woman. No one else embraces disorder and its coherence, allow oneself to be elaborated by if indeed when politics are to be underwritten by a desire to take this country down. The alternative bypasses the immediate relationality between the master and slave. Yes, demand for politics, the anti-totality of the dissenters, the panoptic gaze of whiteness in favor of radical disjunction against the world's grammar ethics, voting negative is picking up the gun, become the ultimate stick-up artist. Wilderson 10. And Black Boy looks at White Boy Baldwin wrote about those moments when blackness inspires white emancipatory dreams of how it feels to realize the impossibility and inverse the ghastly thing about trying to convey to a white man the reality of legal experience has to do with this man's relationship to his own life. He will face in your life only what he was willing to face, and his Baldwin puts his finger the nature and the impasse which allows the black to categorize white to white thought without risking a white to black encounter. There's a difference that I think he imagines he has something to say for his I've never had anything to lose. The key to the structural prohibition barring blackness from the conceptual framework of human empathy can be located in symbolic value. That's something to say when your ballot refuses the affirmative call freedom by orienting yourself towards the end of the world. This movement is not leading, but rather a movement toward a catastrophe in institutional morality and epistemological coherence. In order to strip America's moral viability, we must take the master's house by storm and take it by any means necessary. Woderson and Tim reparations suggest a conceptually coherent loss of land, labor, power, etc. In other words, there has to be some form of articulation between the party that's lost and the part that is gained for reparation. Makes sense. No such articulation exists between the black and the world. This ironically precisely why I support the reparations movement. But my emphasis, my energies, my points of attention are on the word movement, not on the word reparation. I support the movement because I know it's a movement toward the end of the world, a movement toward catastrophe and epistemological coherence and institutional integrity. I support the movement aspect of it because I know that repair is impossible. Any struggle that can act as sick of artists to the world and demanding all that it cannot give, which is everything is moving towards something blindly new that cannot be imagined. This is the only thing that will save us in this Culprit 16. Second formulation of agreement in spatial terms whereby black life is not lived in the world that world lives in, but it's lived in the underground and outer space. Optimism searches within the murky depths, whereas pessimism challenges the alien force of the outside against the philosophical promise. The decisive judgment and psychoanalytic assertion of the power of the unconscious teaches just non-belief in negativity. Such negativity is not the dialectic overcoming anti-blackness or a structural relation to a potential product. Laurel's negation is the pessimistic totality of insufficiency and the posture of blackness concealed its determination in the rest of the universe. Cryptically, the black universe is beyond ontology. Such blackness is not the absence of whiteness. Blackness has its own presence against the presence of black universe and not tied to operations, positivity, double negation, or unconscious to absolute foreclosure. Being against reality and nothingness as aesthetics without representation. The point is not white race and all, but withdraw from the world. Light and colors intended effect is a cataclysm of human color through its blanket totality of blackness that renders color and valid. Perhaps this time for the new utopias, black radical traditions that early turns for the disagreement between black optimism and Afro-pessimism. Both approaches look for alternatives to building a militant black consciousness. The fact that black social depth establishes there are two divergent paths, infinity and nothingness. Black vitalism affirms the irrepressible spirit of blackness as a future to force the homicidal fatality. Blackness theorizes structural positionality. Blackness is a structural outside to civil society. I propose economy as a radical amendment to both way of the laws and insufficiency. The true optimists are the most severe pessimists. They are optimists that run out of options. Our options, final options are many, but beyond their failures, the choice need not be between infinity or nothingness. Utopia may come from the ultimate pessimistic move, complete withdrawal in the site of academic production and the multi-democratic procedural losses within the within the logical liberation only. Resuturing violence is not and Sexton in 3. Leftist approaches that come close to a radical critique as any already fell short. The liberal ethos mixes racism as something characteristic of an individual that can be solved at the social level through education and democratic procedure. Radical critiques assume the issue of racism promises of future transformation, power relations to which deracialization is deferred. What needs to be wrenched from the grasp of white supremacy is left entirely out of the account, named the epiphenomenal or the overdetermined needs, as if there was something at the center of white supremacy too, at a maintaining off which must the utmost Western analytic thought slides helplessly towards the simplistic, the personal, or the institutional. Supposed secrets of white supremacy get soothed in spectacular displays of mythology and instrumentality. The less anti-racism because it's passion, but it gives passion way it signifies the passive acceptance of the idea that race is not essential to the social structure system. Social meetings and categorizations, the same passive apparatus of whiteness that in the mainstream guisely actively forgets that it owes its existence to the killing and terrorizing of those and racialized for that purpose, expelling them from the human fold in the same gesture of forgetting. It's a passivity of bad faith that tacitly accepts that what goes without saying. The postulates white supremacy, and we must start at the flesh of body, obscures the nature of anti-blackness spillers, and 87 before the body's there is flesh. 0 degree of social conceptualization as the primary narrative is seared, divided, ripped apart, and riveted, and the ship's whole following or escape overboard. The smack of whip on the plantation, which is such sincerity and severity, is not only to lacerate the skin but to tear the portions of flesh, anatomical specifications of rupture, alter human tissue, take on objective description, laboratory prose, eyes, beaten out, arms, back, skulls, branded, left jaw, right ankle, punctured teeth, missing chains and knives of bullets, the undecipherable markings of the body can render a kind of hieroglyphics of the flesh whose disjunctures come to be hidden in the cultural scene by skin color. These lacerations, woundings, fissures, tears, scars, opening ruptures, lesions, and punctures. The flesh created cultural vestibularity of survival bears and the marks of a person in cultural text whose insights have been turned outside. This is Rodriguez and A. American globality speaks to the domination through profoundly bodily violence, including genocide and proto-genocidal war making, white and racist and white supremacist institutional violence. This formation of dominance is composed by the U.S. state conceptualization and articulations of its own power. American globality is simultaneously a vernacular of institutional power and active iteration of violent domination at the coherent sociality and the grammar immediacy that order statecraft, white supremacist social, economic, cultural formations organic to the U.S. from shadow shadows racial slavery to neoliberalism warfare constitute the ongoing emergence of American technologies and human incarceration, punishment, white supremacy, a logic of organization that produces conceptions of hard-priced human difference. Mark at human difference.
So your Wilderson O2 evidence seems to indicate that like civil society is not a terrain for a black subject. Why is that true?
Because from an ontological standpoint, the subject, i.e. humanity, relationality, is that which is void from the slave.
Yeah, I guess I'm confused too. What's the warrant for why the blacks can't be subjects?
Because subjectivity isn't as, hey, yo, I exist in the world. Subjectivity is a political schema that says I have the ability to interact relationally,
So where did
socially,
that-
politically within
So
the
where did that
world.
like
The
ontology
slave
start
doesn't
from? Like where did
have
that like I guess death start from?
What?
Like where did that ontology start from then that allowed those people not to be deemed as subjects? Enslavement, so that's where like you'll defend is like the starting point for that. So before then like certain
Why do you
bodies.
think that the middle
Better-
passage
better
serves
question,
as the
what
site
allowed-
where exemplary mode of gratuity becomes
Better
apparent to
question
the
is
world?
what allowed for that demonization of them as subjects to continue.
An entire race which is now ontologically defined as black.
So like the entirety of like monolithic are all not deemed as subjects? Like
What's the
entire.
question?
I guess I'm confused too. Like you make a monolithic statement about this.
I don't
It's
think
like
it's monolithic.
everyone since then is not a subject.
Yes, it does not. It says that they
How's that not
reproduce
monolithic?
Niggas, slaves,
quantities.
black people, not subjects.
So wait, what's the difference between black people and black bodies? Because like you said people, but people seems to indicate it's like a subject position. I'm confused. Yeah, like a people assumes position
that's
of agency.
you're not gonna get away with that. That's cute. Wooderson already
that's what it
articulates that there's like a conundrum sort of black existence. That yes, like we are seen as subjects, i.e. people, but in reality within a political schema we're not. So don't try.
So
to
is this the
like
political
some
scheme?
linguistic shit.
Wait, why is this room the political scheme? Why do we have to be part of that shit?
What do you mean? Like civil society is like everywhere.
society is
Like it's
everywhere.
an encompassing
But
social
but you said-
relationship.
you-
So it's
you
not
made a
like some
statement that's-
disjuncture where you can just be like, oh, it's not
Okay,
in
I guess
here.
I'm kind of confused because you made a statement about certain like forms of like are seen as having subjectivity, but then you said within
What did I say?
political
I don't think I
spheres.
said that. What
You
did I
said
say?
specific spheres. There are areas in which blackness is represented as an agent. What spheres are those if everything is civil
They
society?
are grafted, said to be agents, i.e. like status
Okay.
quo,
Oh, okay.
like
So
black
it's
caucus,
okay.
like, oh, because black people are in Congress, you are subjects of the world, you have subjectivity. Like, that's what we're saying. We're saying that's not true.
It's not true. Like I guess. All right. I guess my next question was like you. Wilderson 10 evidence talks about how one would have to lose the idea of human to become
I just want to
black.
make sure, like, we read some other cards too, but yeah, what was the question?
Yeah, it's just talking about like you have to lose the idea of being human to become black.
That
I
wasn't
guess I'm
Wilderson,
confused by that.
actually. That
That's
was
the Wilderson
Colt.
10 evidence quoted.
Colt talks about the
But what does that
Wilderson
mean,
and
I
both
guess?
Colt talk about the refusal for the idea of human or humanity, like the line of that idea to the slave, because that assumes that if we perform ourselves in a certain way, we can be just like white folks. And
So
the rest
does
of
the
world
alternative
have
result in like
political
people becoming
power.
subjects?
No, we say
No, okay.
subjectivity bad. We say
Alright,
humanism bad. Not
it's
trying to
sad.
like fix it.
I guess we.
The question for this debate is about negating a specific disembodied relationship. Military presence is currently justified by a disembodied relationship to security where the person and actions are inseparable. Drone strikes and ground presence in Somalia represented that disembodied logic when Obama concluded without any review or investigation that the 150 people who died from a drone strike were a part of Al-Shabaab. That liberal move to blame the binary imposed enemy justifies violence by legitimizing a security system that exists thousands of miles away. The bomb that killed those populations, the one he sees a process of social refusal in favor of problem-posing vote affirmative to affirm a praxeological refusal where instead of engaging in traditional strategies like national security, i.e. reduction, we engage in a process of problem-posing where we ask the question not what causes this, but how does the world as it exists make this event possible, which unveils a series of questions like what norms fundamentally ground our ethical understandings. That process of constant questioning and critique produces theory and practice. Dialogically, you conceded a uniqueness argument that frames the importance of our impact. The app is transformative and that it produces a reflexivity that is integrated into the currently unreflexive security apparatus, which poses a uniqueness question, problem for the alternative because there doesn't exist an interrogation as a way in which violence gets extracted domestically and globally, which is also a uniqueness argument that implicates your ability to pick up the gun in the first place. The impact is conceded. It's an element of violence, independent forms of violence stem from a structural norm that inflicts violence, abolishes the construction of frames, allows for securitization, deposits specific hierarchies of life which determine a life livable and unlivable. It's ontological, which outweighs because bodies are placed outside the frame that are subject to violence, to a violent form of negation that exists even prior to their existence. That makes ethics impossible, which is how you should frame this debate. It's also, if we win a method of research, is an interrogation of the way in which security studies has elevated itself to a structural guideline for civil society and vote affirmative because Butler says that it literally grounds our politics as individuals, which questions the underlying framing for civil society. The role of the ballot is that you should vote for the team that produces the best ethical research practice. If we win, that their specific form of engagement is bad, then refuted, then refusal is preferable. We have take committed stance against security studies as a praxis in order to subvert a violent impulse to represent populations violent, which implicates your offense because it always poses the question of representations. Now I know they're going to go for an ethics link in the 2 and C, so I'll preempt it here. There's a difference between Western modes of liberal sentimentality, i.e. an ethical demand to humanitarianly help someone, but that's not our argument. Our argument is very neo-Levinasian, i.e. ethics are not defined by a liberal mode of governance, but rather a proximate relationship that we have to exteriority, which means that they need to have evidence that's necessarily specific. That should also frame any of the link arguments here. Now, permutation to both the winter evidence should filter the link debate for you. It's not about a particular relationality, but the overrepresentation of man that produces those particular relations. Our argument is threefold. First is the Butler evidence, the larger narrative normativity laws for schemes of intelligibility to function as a tool for civil society that exists not only on the political, but also becomes pervasive in the social, the larger master narrative produced by security studies determines a life livable and unlivable, which is based on a specific relationship to a proximate periphery. Now, B is that you should evaluate subjecthood through problematization. The Jackson evidence indicates that in academic spaces there exists the ability to forego a subject relationship which populations exterior to the periphery have by formulating policy takers, which is defined by the object being humanized, forcing the periphery to reshape itself. This is not a literal inclusion, but a kind of discursive production of blackness into sites that reshapes its ethic by forcing a shift in the paradigm that controls and determines life. Now, C is the winter evidence also implicates your evaluation of the ontology debate. She says that quote-unquote human is not the problem, but specifically the overrepresentation of man allowed for itself to replace human, which is not which is just abstractly a periphery in how we determine relations, which is inevitable because we will always relate. The question for this debate is not about alleviating subjecthood, but rather the argument misunderstands how other explanations can account for justification of man. Additionally, the 1AC is a process of refusal against security studies and civil society writ large. It doesn't prescribe a particular criticism of it and omitting of a structure, but rather feeds a process into delegitimizing civil society as it exists by refusing the process that simultaneously legitimizes it, which means there's a sufficient amount of consistency between the alternative and the affirmative to justify permutation. The crucial locus for ontological antagonism is the production of Western man as knower, which detaches knowledge from its use value and turns on itself through the racialization of colonialism. This is Winter 3. The epical rupture was only set in motion by Western intellectuals because it had been made possible by no less than epical reintervention by Western Europe genre of the human, since it was to be specific in terms of the reinterventionist guy, as men they would know it not only come to overrepresent the conception of human by means of sustained rhetorical strategy based on the topos of iconicity, but as human thereby coming to reinvent, label, and institutionalize the indigenous people of America as well as the transport enslaved black Africans as a physical reference for projected rational subrational human other to its civic humanist rational self-conception. All other modes of being human would said not have to be seen as the alternative modes of being that there would be out there, but adaptatively as also a lack of West ontological absolute self-description. The central oversight would that enable both Westernist intellectuals to systemically repress the quote-unquote fugitive truth through its own local culturality. There are few dissets of the alternative. One is the double by neither A. The permutation solves because it begs the question of the world that exists writ large, or you should reject it because it posits a specific root cause which presumes an endpoint to our analysis. Jackson impact turns this by saying that we should constantly impose criticism as a way to refuse the legitimization of structure itself. For an instance, now next is comparativity, framing black bodies as abject, i.e. their first link argument relies on a logic of exception by placing black bodies outside of politics. This frame repeats the same error that had gone been made. It creates a logic of comparison. Some subjects are radically particular, devoid of political subjectivity, while others are comparatively less violated. A better conception argues that racializing assemblages produces subjects who are not subjugated relative to one another. This is not collapse into liberalism, but rather avoids comparativity. This is waylay innate. It is only because Egon codifies the museum of the apolitical human that he can say that the biopolitics of racism transcends race. The thought of an exception cannot but raise a demon of comparison, which in turn tends to reinforce and reinvigorate through the detour of calculability current hegemonic practices of the human as man, instead of fostering a demonic grounded form from and through the reconstruction of category. The example embodies relationality foremost and is an antidote to comparison, since it incites furor and spheres beyond particularity, specificity. Suffering voice should not be understood as the foundations of authenticity, but rather as instantiations of radically different political imaginary. This year's way of reducing subjectivity of the oppressed life to bare life, thinking the political domain produces quote-unquote critical knowledge, which in turn empowers the voice of suffering and makes its own cognitive epistemological intervention by envisioning its own utopia rather than accepting its own position within the ambulatory schemes proposed by the dominant discourse, market discourse, permutation frame. The alternative is a research strategy. If we win that the structural claims of the 1AC are sufficient to radically analyze the structural paradigm of civil society, and there's no reason why you should vote negative. Over-identifying black bodies as suffering maintains a biocentric racialization. McKittrick in 16. The logic of race is anchored by a monumental biocentric narrative that is invested in replicating the scientific racism, even in critique intellectual work, paradoxically undermines the analytical framing racial violence. Descriptions of racial violence also contribute with the ongoing fragmentation of human relationship rather than identifying what's really at stake when the horror takes place. Our collective application of and this implication of descriptive statements that problem from the racialized violence, because the language and process of explicating the racial violence tends to fall back into the axiomatic frame of survival, wherein the suffering body and only the dying has been marginalized human other who stands in opposition to the white Western liberated human norm, precisely because the black death precedes its necessary conceptual frame. This often provides us with the story that corresponds to our existing form of knowledge. One that is already posits blackness and black sense is a place to be dead and dying inhabitants of space, and absolute nothingness can be quite easily discursively colonize our intellectual investigation within the framework we can apparently fix the rate It repair the racial other by producing knowledge within the racial other that renders them less than human. So the biologic scan, only in all body, no one moves. The cynical dead, the only analytical descriptions they condemn remain conceptually intact because the otherwise demands attending to the whole system of knowledge. Therefore, honoring the radical relation reading practices and knowledges wherein brutalities of racial violence are not descriptively rehearsed, but always already demanding practical activities of resistance, encountering radical disembodiment, black studies, and anti-colonial thinking. Additionally, social death reduces the historical record to a false uniformity, pulling focus to the fact of black life and black social life and the gaps between structures is absolutely necessary for resisting the effects of natal alienation. Brown and 9. Hartman is undone by her reliance on Orlando Patterson's totalizing definition of slavery. Emphasis on the personal damage wrought encourages the disavowed 2 generations of social history. One that's demonstrated slaves' remarkable capacity to forge fragile communities, preserving cultural inheritance, and resist the predations of slaveholders. This in turn precludes their ability in describing the ways in which violence, dislocation, death actually generate cultural politics, consequential action by enslavement. Because the women who were the Hubertas were not in fact living dead. They were the mothers of grasping new societies. This was the first and foremost a battle over the presence and time to defining their place in ancestors' can influential progeny, because the connection between Africans is narrated was a narrative continuity between the past and the present. Scholars of slave resistance have never had much concept of the dead. Jesus, Colin, stop messaging me. He does not ignore the violence of slavery, but invokes a bondage between depredations and antithesis. The black self-marketing by the constituted part of it, and Hartman's dispossession of Megas. Rutgers believes that the resistance was crucial to the in which black people forged identity from vital inheritance. Not the relationality argument that exists among subjectivities. Our argument is not a reinstantiation of that, but rather a problematization of narrative's normativity that produces those subjects in the first place. The M and 8. The critique of the subject is radical in the sense that it calls into question the particular kind of subject, such as the relational individual. The challenge is to undo the certainty, experience, action, knowledge, but also must be subject to supersede these acts, because the account of Butler, not developmental accounts of the subject in the sense of outlining a series of events that we undergo in the end of emerge maturely as subjects. Instead, the subject emerges as a question for moral philosophy, insofar as it does not have a status. The subject, therefore, is better rendered for an ongoing process. The process of becoming subject is a process of becoming subordinated by norms to the power relations. Butler explains that we do not encounter norms of power on their own, but they become knowable through encounters with other. Even the personal encounters are personal. Now, the first link argument, I made the difference between the ethics argument, but Winter impacts turns a lot of these link arguments by framing them as abject. The Wiley evidence also impact turns this by saying that that is a necessarily bad frame for framing blackness, because blackness can then never be devoid of not having agency. This also means that we should frame the room as something that is necessarily political. All of your arguments about sphere says that we can frame blackness as agency, and that is problematic. No, the Winter evidence and McKittrick evidence and the Wiley evidence takes out any uniqueness for your link arguments, because it presumes a specific frame by which we can come to know about the world. I don't also know the distinction between their argument about the end of the world and our argument about social refusal. If our argument is about a research strategy that exists in particular academic spaces, it means that a refusal and the end of the world as a pedagogical practice are consistent.
Alright, you good?
Yeah.
Alright, so all of the Wahil, McKittrick, and Brown evidence, I think the Brown evidence is probably, I guess, the closest to this. It talks about, I guess, the capacity for communities to be built within, like, black groups,
the Brown evidence
like
cites
pushing back against like slaveholders' violence. I guess what part of that equates social life?
Our argument, well, okay, you missed the top level part. The Brown evidence speaks to, well, okay, that's fine, but the top level part of the Brown evidence speaks to 2 different types of social lives. Ones in which we had framed it the way y'all have framed it, and the one in which we could create political spaces that recognize agency through historic.
And then Brown goes on to talk about like social life as in like the bare minimum.
Which would answer your first question,
i.e.,
because that
like,
means she still assumes social
had
life.
Communities, like they sang songs, they had hymns and shit.
Sure.
I'm trying to figure out how does that relate to the political schema of social death.
Our argument is that both the political and the social are informative to each other, i.e. the political is determined by the social frames that we enact. The Butler evidence indicates...
No. I need to know, how does the bare minimum, the social, i.e. niggas had Negro spirituals, leads to like political,
because
that is a
social life? Like, what's the linkage between
the problem with, I don't know why you say that's the bare minimal. Why do people's like aesthetics or the way that they go about like relating to the world?
The
why
two,
is that
okay,
bare
the two
minimum?
eight.
That's pretty messed up framing.
Okay.
Talk about people's like seeking as a bare minimal.
Next question. This McKittrick and 16 evidence, what does it mean? What is biocentric racialization?
The biocentric racialization, McKittrick makes a criticism of the way in which we have framed bodies through a lens of comparativity under what Winter also calls the genre of man, i.e. representation exists based on an overarching conception of man. You have created a comparative analysis. Biocentric racialization would be the kind of scientific racism that exists through the lens of that comparativity, i.e. the way in which we have viewed blackness as opposed to whiteness historically has always been defined by a kind of biological relationship.
Stop looking at like how structurally that distinction is made.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
So we just like, I guess what's the next move? Like we stop.
The next move is to ignore the fact that we should, is to dismiss ourselves from the kind of comparative analysis that is the 1AC and rather move to what Winter calls a triangular.
Assemblages. What does it mean to assemble?
What's that?
What is an assemblage?
It's pretty similar to the comparativity argument I made above about how we can no longer have like comparative analysis, but what Winter and both Whaley call a triangulation of specific relations. An example
What
of
is
this.
assemblage?
Huh?
You can answer your question. What is assemblage?
What is assemblage?
Yeah.
Assemblage would be something that is not
Give me an example
binaristic.
of racial assemblage. Like what would that? How
The
is
triangulation
racial
argument I was making
assemblage?
above about how triangulation does not exist as a binary imposed understanding
Sure,
of racial
so
identity, but like
let's say
settlerism.
Corey is not a debater. How do I racially?
Sorry, one more time?
How do I racially assemble myself?
How do you
What-
racially
what-
assemble yourself? By producing analysis that works in what Winter and Whaley call triangulation,
I'm
which
a
is
nigga who's not in debate. How do I racially assemble myself? What does it look like materially to do that politic?
what is it? I'm very confused. I can't speak for ones that exist external to the debate sphere because I've made a framing issue about how this sphere is
Last
necessary.
question. Never mind, actually.
Cool.
So, bro.
Cool.
I'm good.
Wait, actually, no. There's still more. No.
Okay. I got it.
Yeah, we're good.
928.
Okay. I need some water first, I'm sorry.
Sure. Did anyone else get dropped from the internet, or is it just me?
I'm still on.
Yeah.
It just randomly kicks people off.
Oh, okay.
I will take that.
I didn't know what column you were talking about when you said someone was messaging you. I was like, wait, oh.
I couldn't read like the bottom part of the brown evidence because Colin's notification popped up and I was like, damn it. It's cool though. It's like it sucks because you don't even have to be logged into Facebook for that to happen.
Don't have it on your computer. I don't have it.
No, it's the desktop function that Facebook has. Yeah, you're smart.
What's going on over there, Brock? You Facebooking?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally Facebooking.
obviously prepping for the 1 hour. Obviously.
I mean, to be fair, it's not like I don't know it. I guess I could check my email.
Huh? I misread this piece.
I think it's my turn.
Can I see if your charger works? Mine's like super like.
Yeah, that might be.
Hell yeah. We're good. Except now I need to pull it out. Actually, I'm not even sure. I have like
Vote negative to reveal the structural antagonism indifferent to the smooth function of American state nation rooted in both the lands of red peoples and the flesh of black bodies as blackness is and exists as a permanent state of nature in order to formulate a right point to define humanity, both junior partners and settlers on terrain civil society. This revealing God's and epistemology aimed towards the destruction of the entire modern world as we know it is revolving around the axis of black education in the name of white life. The 1AC has no game on the objective subjective vertigo question of the debate, i.e. that blackness is a crossroads between performative contingencies, i.e. all of the structural violence and mirrored identities suffer at the hands of the state, i.e. all of the 1AC's articulation of how violence is articulated through things like disembodiment and gratuitous violence, i.e. the life of disorientation, the constitutes the structural antagonism relationship between the human, i.e. the subject, and the object, the liminal black, which means that all of your contingent claims about anti-blackness make so sense instead as a reason to prioritize our framing for the debate as modalities of blackness subsequently determines the violence for all of their bodies. Now to the Luke here first, the distinction between body and the flesh, the essential difference between captive and liberated subject positions, the Negroes becoming biological is and should be understood not only as an act of dismember but also as a form of non-productivity. Our argument is that only the slave possesses a relationship to violence that cannot be analogized as both structural and performative insofar as life constituted by disorientation produces the black as anti-political and forges the symbiosis between the human and the slave. Social death is a condition of existence, a 700-year injunction barring the slave activity. You can't just fucking attach it to a tagline. And so far as no other body functions as a repository of complete disorder, Wilson says blackness is the side of absolute dereliction to the level of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real. So far as one, in its magnetizing bullets, i.e. the constant practice of violence continues to reposition the slave. The black now functions as the map of gratuitous violence through which all violent civil society is possible. Two, blackness in America clearly generates no capacities or chronological categories for sovereignty insofar as the experience and milieu of the slave is one without heritage or passion. Three, black is a focal genital object. Whoever says rape says black, whoever says prison says black, i.e. African origin females never qualified as women because their cartographic relationality to gender never existed, therefore not interpolated to partake in the social construction of gender, which is how modern gender now constitutes itself for the paradigmatic separation of women from slavery, but more so how modernity collectively shaped how agency and is reproduced and produced through and stifled through means of non-consent. Now only the political and libidinal economy of the plantation, the site where the black becoming the site of demobilization, structured how our contingent understanding of value, gender, and agency emerge simultaneously as the African ontology becomes the black, which means the slave's flesh does not emerge as a fungible object of modality. Slave terror improves the affect the process of fungibility when the slave now emerges as the suturing inert matter out of which epistemologies and practices of mirrored economies of sexuality, gender, and geopolitical agendas are now assumptively the foundation by which the slave economies are now created. This is demonstrated in a couple ways. First is the promise of freedom. Our Firkin, where Wilson evidence says that the promise of freedom is not intimately connected to the construction of the liminal object as black slavery is the foundational to modern humanism's modern on-take understanding of freedom, i.e. that notion of freedom can be understood as experience, as the notion of freedom cannot be understood as experiential for the slave, as black freedom would be freedom from humanity, freedom from the world, an ontological representational status of motherfucking death, which means even if they get away thereafter, invocation to things like grievability. They will not get out of this. Butler clearly articulates the fact that what is deemed livable and what is not deemed livable, i.e. that is only descriptive of a contingent manipulation rate of racialization, and proves the one to see the lie of liberalism that assumes the process of political rhetoric and the interrogation of Western liberalism conceded the sex and evidence via their advocacy creates a redeemable aspect to social structures and turns the app and supercharges the permutation as a link argument, i.e. in the Arya world where whiteness now becomes the tactic of control so far as it papers over its ontological structure foundations turns all of your Wahili evidence. Now, second is demonstrated in Butler's social map of power where she situates her, each of us in specific spatial temporal locations reinforced by categories of identity that should in her eyes easily overlap and coalesce with one another, and that somehow allows us to create ourselves and write ourselves as subjects in ways that exceed our abstract social positionality. Arguments that exploring this space of potential ignores the structural position of the slave. Wilder says the blacks denied personhood at the side of democratic procedure, which means the civics extremity of the slave, at least in the context of debate, determines the ontological category of the black in regards to things like sociality, i.e. the process of self-determination, i.e. the micropolitical disinvestment of the one it includes itself. It only becomes cyclical because it says all the sex and evidence about the economy of desire, how it gets regrafted on the flesh, means if we're winning a marginal link to how we tend to regard or talk about white supremacy and assume it can be solved at the democratic social procedure, that means the average is a process of self-adjustment that predicates its line source experiential freedom, and it assumes that it is ready, that we can make ourselves ready for the fight against things like gratuity and liberation, which ignore the person who is denied to the slave, i.e. our third piece of Wilson evidence says that reproducing the object through a process of recoding the liminal back is bad, that effective responses, i.e. should not be prioritized as an effective counterattack, i.e. all of their discursive analysis about rejecting how we change the status quo does not understand that blackness disarticulates the unmediated social realm of communication, that the simple act of being heard by the other turns into an endeavor that cannot be reconciled with his or her status as speaking implement, that the berries the slave makes on the page are too motherfucking thin and watery to secure the words. Now, our culpa evidence has not been answered at all. It says our model of insufficiency to frame the alternative, the affirmative, requires no line of fight for the slave as blackness is what makes modernity possible in both terms of economic and ethical reflection in the first place. The relationality of politics and one sees the figuring by which its very own nature, temporality is translated into history and narrative. Our culpable evidence says that the slaves captured by the settler currently defines a position that suggests blackness must not be defined by the absence of whiteness, and instead blackness must exist as its own position, which is why we must dance with death as a radical movement towards the end of the world. Now, the one sees is obviously just another disembodied politics insofar as it assumes the discussion of bodily focus is different from prevailing international security practices, which is fucking wrong. It proves the one sees reflexivity, it fuses capacity and relationality that still embodies bodies as a side of possibility. All of the social debate should be filtered here. The one sees obviously makes the other relatable and Leviathan, i.e. that we may not know their social location, but their mere existence ties us to a transcendental modality of being, which is particularized and extended to everyone, which is how their politics recenters white agency insofar as the shared experience of racialization obscures the singularity of anti-blackness argues that even though black existence does not represent the total reality of the racial formation, it does relate to the totality, and that it indicates the repressed truth of the political and economic system. Now, the initial vantage point of the affirmative is the American human insofar as the precariousness of a prayer or whatever the fuck we should do in discourse is somehow supposed to understand the interrelational status of identity that never questions the very system that's produced both in its master, which is the condition of liberalism. Butler only asks the question, how do we ensure the dissenting voices are heard within American democracy? She assumes these voices will bring us back to find the human where we don't expect to find it in like its frailty and its the limits of its capacity. Our argument is that we must resist this strain of cultural criticism, i.e. that we should distance ourselves from the struggles for recognition about access to culturally viable notions of humanity in the first place. The McKittrick evidence is where you lose the debate. It says the production of black spaces in the diaspora is tied to locations that are explicitly produced in conjunction with race, racism, and colonial geographies. McKittrick says the land masses occupy those indigenous to Africa and the Americas were both spatially and corporeally the geographic non-location through which the plantation emerged, which means you cannot explain away the racial you cannot explain away the transnational racial slavery by situational place. If blackness is perceived as uncontainable, as the subsequent non-location determines its lack of coordinates on the map of things like regulation, then it means that we shouldn't understand militarism as intimately linked to the making of man into a soldier, but rather the man versus nature expulsion of the non-being, which is why your winter evidence is a reason to vote negative. Now, all of the reparations clearly don't make sense. It is not an impossible demand to the system so far as their experiential responses or future transformative ideologies do not matter, i.e. all the arguments about how the slave positions itself as a demandless antagonism means all the Sexton evidence about how the economy desire gets regrafted to the flesh means that we cannot like create narratives to consign ourselves towards the status quo. Also, black death is sustainable only through white life, which means that if social death outweighs physical life, then that is our elaboration towards death. That our move towards social death is the severance of blackness as relational, as dependent on the lack, which means that we just have to win that our links justify the AF as a mean of coherence, and we win. Which means even if they win that their AF overcomes a particular humane, implicated alienation of geopolitical, mapping. The modern life began with fucking slavery. It broke Europe in fucking half. It made them slave masters, made them crazy, but also proves the affirmative will always try to reconstruct discourse in order to make the system appear true, which is our mystification link. It's also how modalities of war were produced in the first place. Also turns the app. Their only arguments on this debate is that the butler creates a form of gratuitous violence. That our card literally says transgendered people are a signal out. This does not understand the singularity of anti-blackness, i.e. that obviously those positions put all violence, that the way that blackness is perceived determines the violence for all other systems. Is also a reason for why. It's also a reason for why all of the arguments about reflexivity don't make any sense. They say role of the ballot is ethical. We're obviously producing anti-ethical research. All the ballot evidence about intelligibility doesn't make sense. They say subjecthood exists for individuals, i.e. that we can become, that some subjects are devoid of subjectivity. How the fuck is that possible? Clearly that's possible for you. Our argument is that clearly that precariousness relationality, the assumption that they can do that is fucked up. They assume that the alternative is objection by relegating its totality of social death and death. That's not the alternative.
You good? Yep. You've made a quote in the 2NC that says black death is sustained through white life. Why does that not double turn your argument that says that blackness shouldn't be known or understood through the
status quo says blackness is the term, i.e. blackness is only understood through its relationality with white life.
Dude, your impact framing argument was black.
Nigga, that's how sustainability is fucking produced in the status quo. Our move away from that is the alternative. We should not be consigned to relationality.
So then that leads me to my
with
next
whiteness.
question, which is why is the AF that?
Why is the F that? All the link arguments you can see. The first piece of second evidence says the ability that we can solve racialization.
Can you
at the level of-
contextualize? Can you contextualize my question to the 1AC? My
Yeah,
question.
I am. Section says that the ability for us to assume that we can solve things like racialization, all of the 2AC
Cool, I don't think the
arguments,
1AC
all the
I don't
2AC
think the-
arguments
I don't think
about.
the 1AC made a claim about solving racialization.
So you don't solve anything. You don't solve a discursive
No,
ability
because the
to
Jackson evidence
resitu-
impact turns that. So my
I
question.
disagree.
I cut the evidence. Anyway, you have said that we should acknowledge the structural position of the slave. What comes after that in terms of what Zach's ballot
Well, there's your
represents?
problem right there. That what comes after that, we're always concerned about our points of energy and attention are always centered towards
Well, no, I
what do
think
we
that's
do
a good
after
point.
that.
Also kind of
But
sends
also,
a weird like endpoint that you seem to be.
I don't think there's an
turning on
endpoint.
our
I'm just
side.
curious if
The
there is
ballot
a
only
something that the.
represents who
yeah,
we
you
are.
did
I'm
say
not
we
rel-
shouldn't
I'm
have
not-
an endpoint.
Okay, no,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
no endpoint. My question is if we have recognized that
So
structural
why ask-
position,
why
what
ask
is
valid?
Zach's what does Zach's ballot represent?
Who
Yeah.
won and who lost.
yeah, that too. Yeah.
Okay, so then how can Zach verify that or validate?
He can say I voted negative.
Right, but if this
Presumption,
debate's a
because
question
the
of
app-
if this debate is a question of relationality and you have made a relationality argument towards the subject of whiteness, how can Zach validate that? Given that Zach is not
By
black.
saying that the link was true. What?
Wait, okay,
I'm
so
very-
that doesn't
I'm
make
very
any
confused.
sense. My
Like, how
question
does
is
he
more about
validate
recognition
that
politics.
relationality exists?
No, how can you say that there doesn't exist relationality, but somehow Zach can validate the arguments
Blackness
that you have
should
made
be-
about blackness?
Blackness should be
Look, it's not
consigned
like
towards a world where
relationality in, like,
relationality
a
doesn't
vacuum.
exist.
Okay, wait,
We're
you both are
making a
talking at the
very-
same time. I
we're
can't
making a
understand what
very
you're saying.
particular like analysis of what relationality means, i.e., that black people, black bodies, the slave has the ability to grasp subjectivity in relation to whiteness. So like, don't try to like flip this.
Wait,
shit
okay,
into,
hold on.
like,
Okay,
oh,
so your argument
relationality is impossible,
Your argument is
means
that
we can't
blackness
talk to you
can
and
understand
shit.
subjectivity, but not the other way
No,
around.
that
So then I don't know why that
blackness
answers
does
my
not have
question.
The ability to grasp subjectivity. That subjectivity is absent of the slave in the world, and so relationality becomes a myth that is fed to the slave. I.e.,
That's-
you can become
Yes.
close to the master.
That's okay, no, but I don't know why that answers my relationality argument. You have extended a link argument right now, but you have not answered a recognition politics argument.
Relationality to like, oh, can we talk to people? Like, can there be like?
Yeah, no, it's not about talking, it's about validation. So answer my question again. How can Zach validate the claims of non-blackness if you win your relationality
There
argument?
is this an antagonistic structure.
Right, which would prove that there's no
Relationality.
relationship that can. Okay, that's fine.
I'm ready when you are.
You can extend the anti-ethics framework for witness and evidence in the one you see the world of modernity exists as an antonym to the very logic of the value for the slave, precisely because the slave operates as an object of labor whose embodiment of violence objection serves as the creation of the world's affirmation of sovereignty and value. Thus, the action in the world without direct antagonism to the world only sutures violence back into seemingly positivist. Ethics means our only ethical action is to reject the status quo ethical actions and favor the alternative. Now the world, the affirmative posits the role of the judges being the best mode of ethical research. For one, I think we're already impacting the notion of what it means to be ethical, what our orientation towards ethical research will ever mean in a world of modernity or civil society. I think the Wilderson evidence that we read that enticed upon the concept of relationality proves the impact on this question. Wilderson posits that rhetorical analysis like James Baldwin seek to find value or positionality or possible subjectivity within the world. This is emblematic of the one AC's discussion via the Jackson as well Jackson as well as the Butler evidence has the potentiality for there to be an expansion of humanism to the realm of the abject or the realm of the realm of the abject. This is precisely the appeal of lines towards subjectivity to the slave that inevitably lacks within the reformist logic, a push and pull interplay of civil society. From our first piece of Wilderson evidence that talks about objective vertigo is that very disorientation or appeal to logic that you can be within the world that allows for violence to be sutured within that context. Now this is emblematic of the Greenswald and 16 evidence when they give an example how 150 Somalians were killed through drone strikes and that they weren't even Al-Shabaab, that they were grafted to Al-Shabaab. This is precisely the production of relationality. Wilderson continues to define it as a mode of empathy that produces a relationship to the listener, i.e. the slave, and the master. If we were able to deconstruct the normative violence or the criminal aspect of the slave, then possibly the master will recognize the slave's humanness and allow for gratuitous violence to end. This is precisely what resutures a mode of multiculturalism or integration into civil society that makes violence permeable and fungible, never able to deconstruct. This is precisely how the affirmative re-entrenches that very logic, which means that they don't get a fucking permutation in this context because the alternative is literally a refusal to find ourselves within the world, whereas the affirmative is the idea that there is a possibility for there to be marginal acceptance within the world, i.e. their Jackson evidence as to how they can expand, how they're analyzing the system allows for there to be pushing of the margins further so that bodies are brought back into the periphery of visuality and seeing. But this this ignores the scripted mode of violence that our Spiller's evidence articulates out of the one and see that the flesh comes before the body, that we are always already ontologically founded as that which holds and bars violence, i.e. impossibility for subjectivity. They don't fucking answer this out of the 2AC dome. Let the 1AR get up here and try to spin some fancy bullshit as to how they get out this think that we're winning. I think that we're winning a pretty good empathetic relationality argument. I also think that we have the only interpretation of what relationality means in the context of social political interactions, which is probably a reason why you can vote negative on presumption on face value. Now there are you make this racial assemblages argument, but one, this doesn't make any fucking sense because they don't have a grounding for what that means to actually perform in politics. The racial assemblages also go for a multiculturalism disad right here because this is precisely the status quo functions that we need to move away from the idea that you are slave. We need to affirm that you have a possibility for subjectivity. This is what allows for violence to be sutured in and of itself and become emblematic of society, not just on the institutional level of guns being aimed at niggas, but also the way that anti-blackness perpetuates and permeates into research, and social relationships, i.e. economies and literal grafting of geographies where bodies are placed, which probably accesses the McKittrick evidence. This is the reason why you prefer the negative on this question, because we are the only ones that are providing contextual framing. Now the only game that they have possibly is this Winters evidence that they say we need to the human is not the problem, but the conception of man. But I think the Winters still flows negative on this question because it isn't just the pure delineation of man, but also the ideology that there is a possibility that there was man one and thus man two, which is Winters' theorization of how the logic of man evolves. Man two, how homo economicus operates, the positionality of the social subject that mindset which has relationality, appeal to ethics, the ability to move through politics. Man, one, well, simply the conception of a religious or spirituality that was put into juxtaposition of those who were heathenistic. I think we access man two better than the affirmative because we are deconstruction or removal from the very logic as to what social democratic relationships look like. This is a Martinot and Section 3 evidence that they don't have an answer to. That social democratic procedure, i.e. We are social refusal, that we can just say no to this shit, somehow ameliorates the position of a structural position, doesn't do shit, but only allows for white people to pat themselves back. This is precisely what I'll label as voyeurism. This that allows for there to be a viewing or a cascading of suffering without an actual deconstruction or alignment. Be our cope evidence with it, which is the wallowing within blacklist or a refusal to exist, a refusal to be human, never allows for that violence to continue. Also, I think we have a better answer as to how the human still encapsulates the notion, the notion of man. This is reason 12. The enlightenment notion of the human, the discourse and economies, the academy saturates this project black as alien or foreign appendages grafted to the body, state, U.S. post-slavery, Carlos, and Chucky, imagine speaking commodity blackness, and black people manifest a subjectivity that is kin to subjectivity in humans. However, it's not human, it's subjectivity of objects, not humans, that is subjectively imagined, commodity, legal, and jurisdictional acts do not resolve. Remember, state the slave, the historical, linguistic, or popular cultural representation, and the legacy of objectiveness. How might disorderly, functionally, replicate, potentially diseased black body infect the policy state, the dominated conversations, and so grading black bodies into country at large on a mark, country at large. Now, this evidence is important because they say that the problem is not the human, it's not the man, but one, the very notion of human still grafts out a delineation from nature and bodies that makes it possible for the human to become a thing in the first place. Clear impact.
10. Yeah.
Hey, Corey, you didn't read this first card?
No, I didn't.
ran to the bathroom.
Go for it.
Give me water.
That's the 2 AC.
Yeah, thanks.
Do y'all want water?
No.
Got that motivation right there. Go. Alright.
You didn't even need to like pause for you to go to the bathroom. You could have just caught it on the live stream when you came back.
Oh yeah, and then I could get and Ricardo making so much sense.
Just blow in a 3-minute delay. It's all good.
Yeah, I'll just pop in real quick, make sure I got what I need for the 2-way arm. It's all
Or yeah, no, just listen in while you go. And
Yeah, I mean, Ricardo's falling for you.
what would I do without you? Alright,
How much trust do you have?
alright, Brockham.
Alright. You know where it's at. Is there anyone not ready? The question for this debate about negating a disembodied relationship, we engage in a process of problem posing. It's a constant questioning and critique of proofs of actually dialogically without for a problem posing, not problem solving. That turns for the criticism of the block and see the uniqueness or the frames the importance of our impact because the act is transformative and produces reflexivity in the way security apparatus integrating unit reflexivity. That act means that it controls unique for either alternative. I don't think there's a fucking alternative explanation coming out of the block about how they access the form of the gun or that can control that uniqueness because the same security apparatus still is embodied from that relationality. That means they don't need to use any form of their all or link form of analysis for that access to solve. But you have a better form of the impact is normative violence being conceded that is higher collective determine that life is valuable and unlabeled. This is ontological because of ways because that means the same form of impact frame because bodies are placed outside of that frame. It's going to stay for the ontological for the violence or outside of that periphery. Now go to the rule of the battle. The rule of the battle. You vote for the team that best versus the most ethical praxis or subverted violent in Paul's service and population violent because that way that those form of preempted we preempted the argument about the ethics like they conceded the argument from the theme evidence that answers back all of their arguments on the rule of the battle. That theme they drop the block and makes the first contextual defense of Butler's argument on subjectivity. We are not a reinstitution of man, but because the process of becoming a subject is for Butler a process of becoming subordinated by norms by which power relates that do we not encounter norms and power in their own but we become knowable through the encounters with others should frame this debate for you because it means we have not produced a relationality in this debate. They have instituted a politic there will understand evidence is criticized but rather we framed 11 Nazi ethics argument as a detriment for your ballot not a westernized form of subject always trying to create a better form of the world but rather we are refusal to accept that form making a better world. That means we access also terminal defense and most of their link arguments. I'll go more to the probably the first the permutation permutation do both still solve the winter evidence should filter the link debate for you were going to win because they have a terrible misreading of the entire the winter evidence, not about particular raciality, but the overrepresentation of man that produced a particular relations or argument is three, but also is going to answer back the argument they made later on about how winter understanding of first is Butler evidence. They conceded that the larger narrative of normativity will implicate other forms of intelligibility that exist not large. Secondly, you evaluate subject-coded problematization or Jackson evidence indicates that academic spaces exist able to forego subject relation with populations exterior to the periphery. This or impact their analysis that we cannot become relationality for the way we cannot come to understand force the subject of the self-production of blackness and reshapes the force of ethics. Also, the winter evidence implicates here the evaluation of ontology base. She says that human is not the problem, but specifically how the overrepresentation of man allows itself to replace the human, which is just abstractly a periphery, how we determine relations, which is inevitably because we relatable. The question for this debate is not about elevating subject because their debate argument misunderstands the other explanation of the account for the human. That means periphery, the alternative is a research strategy still is conceded. They don't have an answer to if we win. The structural claims of the 1AC are sufficient to radically analyze in structural position. We can radicalize the way we interpret a man in the first place that creates a subject position that is outside of the status quo form that they are critiquing in the first place. There, the notion of the body flesh link doesn't come to understand this contextualization. They talk about social stuff, but they misunderstand. We are talking about impact turn to their understanding that those bodies cannot have form of agency. We don't talk about more as bodies, but rather as people that can have forms within certain areas of agency. Brown evidence specifically talks about how when in other certain areas of spheres and places the agencies are actually shown with certain types of dialect and other forms. That answers back there multiculturalism forms of arguments because we have a specific form of analysis on this. Additionally, the 1AC's refusal against security studies, that means it doesn't prescribe to a particular criticism of any structure, but rather a process that delegitimizes the civil society by refusing the process that legitimizes it in the first place. The idea that that's sufficient amount of consistency between F and the L sin. The next piece of winter evidence, the crucial locus of ontological intelligence, and they have a terrible misreading of this. First of all, and the one in already makes the argument that winter doesn't say way 1, way 2, but rather winter says comparativity is bad. That's what we were impacting, but ignores how the triangularization of Eurocentrism in the 15th century allowed for rationalism become a tool for manifest. Not the same example. They talk about how the slavery was the point for starting point for that, but not a form of rationalism. That means framing black bodies as abject relies on the logic of exception by placing black bodies outside of politics. This frame creates a logic of comparison. This position of some bodies is radically particular, devoid of political subjectivity. We're going to win multiple links to this because there was no 2 evidence to talk about how those bodies can never have that subject to, but that categorized white modernity violently created and over-identifying black life as suffering and codifies the assumption that man is only a genre of humanity rather than disrupting it. It replicates the logic of particularity and comparativity that we are impact turning. We don't have to win the entirety, just have to win impact turns the entirety of the negative alternative metric for humanity at large. That's racialization disset from the McKendrick evidence is mishandled because over-identifying black bodies of suffering and dying maintains a biospheric racialization there. Answers the permutation don't answers because this is the dialectic of blindness that the background upon which man is projected divine from humanity concedes too much. McKendrick argues that this formalization normalizes the hegemony of man, considering the structure of Western modernity to an ontological condition. Secondly, is abjugation that over-identifying with suffering and death blackness as human life presumes that black life can be positively articulated, a meaningful mode of being when there's any radical description of blindness precluded principle by rehearsing the logic of anti-blindness that we inherit. Their Wilderson evidence is a particularly good example because it says the blindness can only be identified only in its abjugation, never in its value by being human. This proves our Brown evidence by talking about they reduce the historical record to a false informity. Lithic statement I point out form a cross-section example between the structural doubts for crucial effects of natal alienation that are shown through the forms of resistance. That proves that we can have forms that are subject. This is not the cool option because we know power of our punished performance we make or argues about how any blindness functions, about how our intellectual work that seemens in subverts the process that answers back multiple their multiculturalism this that too the reputation we're not form of co-option. If we're wrong about this, the ballot would be irredeemable change. We make the argument of rationality that how if that doesn't make any sense because you wouldn't have that rationality for why you could vote for them happening in the first place. Now they also make a few other arguments on the reasons, but their arguments on the reasons also why they're going to lose this round arguments. Reese, a 23-year-old who had a shit dissertation art scholarship, is better because it presumes a relationship that is more historically grounded in arguments about ontology. Beg the question of historical analysis means we control. It begs the question because the relationality was produced from rationalism in the first place, not from the idea of the slave. Our arguments access the most powerful term like that means per permutation of anti-blindness as an ontological structure is created and maintained through this restrictive statements that control what we mean by when we say human. This world can only be disrupted by disrupting this level of power. Example of human that they've created McKendrick 16. The plantation context of regard to the possibility black man normally they like the more knowing that system why just permitting anti-black race and weird violence going around the system, but the plantation system that do some much laboring black body there, laboring a black person, other anti-black subject, social racial identification, land black practices, expertly located. Market located.
9:31.
Just a second.
Oh my god. Okay. Real quick, Ricardo, do you know how to take off the desktop option for Facebook? Because I'm realizing I can't give speeches.
Desktop notifications.
Yeah, I like that. Actually,
You just turn them off in Chrome.
that makes sense. Okay. I can do that at some point, but it's getting. Alright, are we ready?
Oh, 1 second.
Oh, okay, cool.
I'm good.
Our model is efficiency to frame the alternative is our dance with death. The affirmative requires no line of flight for the slave is blackness is what makes modernity possible in terms of both economic and ethical reflection. They only need to realize their politics is relational to translate its temporality into history and narrative. There's no answer to the narrative relationality debate. The one are the assumption we can recognize ourselves in specific temporal locations that somehow allows us to tell discursive stories that create things like social life is the things is to culture things like liberal humanism. What is that the process of self-determination, i.e. the micropolitical disinvestment of the one only becomes cyclical because it includes itself to the dynamics and social mediation of the status quo, which is how the economy of desire gets recrafted onto the flesh, but also it's a reason why there is no democratic space by which we can make alienation connections to things like relationality and vote negative to refuse the affirmative gesture towards things like religion. Understand that the political discourse surrounding the affirmative only expands the process of circulation that bars blackness from destabilizing civil society's ontological structure of empathy. The ballot represents the continued crackdown and destabilization of previously accepted categories of current thought about political intervention, which understands we never had anything to lose from the beginning. That black death is self-sustainable only through a benevolent cyclical process of gratuitous violence that repairs so far as body contingent actual relationality for the slave is impossible. So even if the one is something that should be prioritized, the existence of motherfucking America becomes a preconditional means of ethics, which means voting negative is the ultimate anti-ethical refusal and represents the deviant chaotic nature of succumbing to modalities of blackness, as that blackness is the anti-original constitution of a radical force that defies the normativity status quo, i.e. our program of complete disorder is not just a gesture of resistance that functions as a politic refusal, but also a refusal to affirm, which is how the alternative's invocation to sever the master-slave relationality is in fact freedom from the idea of freedom, which is the nature of the alternative, which is pretty much blackness must not be defined by the absence of whiteness, but instead must exist as its own position, which is why we must dance with death as a radical movement towards the end of the world. Was cope with evidence God conceded you have conceded the vertigo question out of the debate in the 2AC like there's literally no coming back from that. Lil, you conceded 4 links in the 2AC. I shouldn't have to respin the wheel. There are distinctions in vertigo. The you have lost the trade-off question between humanity and backs and proving contingent undertakings in particular forms of violence, whether that be from the prison industrial complex or whether it be from geopolitical understandings of international geography. It means that blackness is a sentient being with a political ontology is radically different than that of the human, i.e. that of the post-colonial, which means it is the prime racial signifier for which all of the violence occurs, which also means that in a vacuum things like demands fail, i.e. the plan, the advocacy statement fails. Now Wilson is critiquing the demand for reparation, the demand for reform, the demand for relational status in humanity. Wilson says certain forms of writing in so far as how writing affects what changes. The next question, what did they ask off? Who are they talking about? How is white supremacy not seen as a footholder in conjunction with their argument that we can make tangible responses to the status quo? Wilson says blackness disarticulates the unmediated social realm of communication that the simple act of person turns into an endeavor that cannot be reconciled with his status as speaking implement, which means we win the after just a contingent communicable attempt at explaining white supremacy. They are interested in empirical enunciation for social political recognition, which implicates the process of self-determination as it includes itself. It gives itself away to the dynamics of sociality, dynamics of sociality. Our section evidence assumes this. It says it places narrative here in debate tucked away, constantly repeating itself. Then it will somehow resolve the structural model of racism. Let's talk empirics, i.e. conceded the social death argument that the plantation reconfigured the social logic of the United States insofar as under the expropriation of flesh, one is neither female nor male, i.e. is both subject are taken into account as quantities, which means structural representations of violence is a reason to vote negative in the world. We're the only ones with an understanding of how black men and women in the status quo were black men and women in the status quo were effeminized in the first place. Which also is a reason for why your understanding of racialization in the status quo does not assume that time has been accumulated. Now, all of their disembodied relationship arguments have ignored the entirety of the block's analysis about how discursively the one sees constant focus on problem solving and transformative reflexivity assumes a world where that inversion, that infusion of capacity is possible. Either you're just another prevailing international security discourse that assumes all bodies that are placed outside the periphery conceded the spillage evidence sort of experience racialization and sexualization the same plain arguments that blackness is that political ontology. Now, the role of balance shifting argument is the reason they lose and proves that whiteness doesn't exist in staticity, that there is no realm in which subjectivity slows down. In order for us to distance ourselves from that antagonistic relationship improves the permutation as a link supercharges the fundamental nature of the affirmative, the point in which the slave now emerges as a suture matter, which particular epistemologies now seemingly have lines that fight for the save, which also indicts your Leviathan understanding, but also they don't get a permutation because the pedagogy of the negative and the affirmative are in opposite directions. They say that it is possible to extend subjectivity to the non-subject. We say that as such as acts only reinforces the world's violent multiculturalism, wherein we assemble ourselves and disavow the violence of racialization, i.e. spillers, and the flesh, and how we cannot move outside of the position of the slave extent, which all the extension of sex, and which allows anti-blackness via liberalism to function in vacuum. Winters is the reason they lose the debate. They pigeonhole Winters' work to assume an amorphous understanding of the Enlightenment notion of the human. She states that the rupture that was to lead the gradual development of the physical sciences have been made possible only by the no less epical reinvention of Western Europe's genre of the human. Which this is important because it gives way to our reason evidence that the human itself is a social creation made to delineate regulation from nature through varied mechanisms of interaction, which is Winters' conception of man. Man 1 is the Judeo-Christian rational subject. Man 2 is the social democratic subject. They lose because they're inability to grapple with the problem of the human as that which is separate from the world, which can control it through certain mechanisms of interaction, allows for the gratuitous violence to reinvent itself into the human, which means their concept of man becomes inevitable. Every time they say we need to extend the notion of the human to those in the periphery, they performed an eternal double term via their own Winters evidence, as well as a clear link to the Williston evidence about Baldwin and the critique of relationality, the idea that the slave should be in the world rather than the end of the world, which also indicts the McKendrick evidence. You should look at the McKendrick evidence. It literally understands that even in a world where they're winning, the ontological gratuitous nature of dead zones in which individuals occupy is the reason for why the transatlantic racial slavery cannot be explained away by things like situational place, which means all of the what I see criticisms about how man intimately understands the world in terms of international security is the reason they lose the debate, because if we're winning that political and that the Wilson is a prerequisite to things like political imaginations or whether or not political trajectories are good, then we are implicating whether or not the process of the what I see was anti-black in the first place, whether or not it included itself towards the slave, didn't have a line of fight for the slave in the first place, which we were winning all those prerequisites to the affirmative. It's a reason why all the permutation doesn't make sense, and it's a reason why the permutation is a link, and it's a reason why they don't get out of anything. Vote negative on presumption. Demand for reparations. How much was that?
523.
500. Sorry.
Where did my stand go?
Don't wink at me, Chris.
You know you like it. Oh, there it is.
Can we review the tape, see where it went?
Yeah, can I check recording afterwards and to check on some arguments that were made earlier? I don't have on my phone.
It's already on YouTube. You can if you want.
Alright, is anyone not ready? Super.
I know Brock and I are probably some scrubs from UCO, but we are scrubs that are winning the substance of this debate. At the end of the debate, if you think that black people are just bodies, then vote negative. But if you think that that's not true, that there are black people that are self-aware, human, and don't need your recognition from non-blackness and vote affirmative, could you accept that black people are human and not give yourself credit for making that true? Yeah, probably, but that doesn't get you off the hook. If you think that it is true that you should vote affirmative because we have won a good frame for our analysis of blackness, you can't also win the liberal ethics argument because one, we've recognized all of you as agents, and so have our authors from the same litmus as you are. Affirmative is also a research strategy which frames which should be the frame for this debate for us as pedagogical agents, and for you as an educator, your ballot represents a framing of blackness that gives life to blackness. You should read the McKittrick evidence because the newest shit on that side of the literature, which none of their scholarship assumes. I know it sounds like some wacky uniqueness argument, but we've also got literature that makes more nuanced claims about your analysis. Additionally, even if they win that the affirmative is bad, you can still vote affirmative because we have multiple dissets of the alternative that are not answering. That's sufficient to vote affirmative. I also don't think there's sufficient amount of alternative analysis in the 2-R. You shouldn't evaluate their argument, and you shouldn't evaluate their argument then because it's a linear dissent, and we have enough of a justification from the conceded permutation for us to win that the social refusal of the 1AC is productive and a good strategy for which this debate should as a research strategy, which is what this debate has been the entire time. Zach, your ballot doesn't represent anything external from this debate, which means if our social refusal in recognition of a particular agency is good, then you should vote affirmative. Now here's the framing issue. Drops the Brown evidence in the 2-R, which should filter the uniqueness for the social death debate. The social death that social death of all black people is a monolithic statement. We are impact turning because it reduced the historical record to a false uniformity of all populations. Specifically, Brown says that this disavows future 2 generations of social history that have demonstrated slaves' remarkable capacity to forge fragile communities, preserve cultural inheritance, and resist the predations of slaveholders. A good example of this is the man who lived in the South that lived in an all-black community and didn't experience racism until he became a journalist in the New York Times. That proves that it's necessary. It's not to prove that racism doesn't exist, but rather that they're contingent on specific events. This also disproves all of their arguments about uniqueness for social justice and justifies a conceded permutation view of the alternative as a research strategy which should frame the debate. Our affirmative is pulling focus on the fact that black social life in the gaps between structures is crucial for resisting effects of natal alienation. No explanation of the permutation is conceding the alternative, which means that you can't win the permutation as a link because we have impact turns to any of your dissets of the permutation. They say we don't answer the narrative relations argument. I disagree. The theme evidence that's also dropped in the 2 in the 2-R makes a claim about it makes a very defensive claim about Butler's conception of things like social death or ontology and says that it is not her trying to reinstantiate a particular sense of subjecthood, but rather criticizing the hierarchy of life that determine a life livable and unlivable, i.e. there's no reason why saying unlivable and unlivable is nothing different between saying objective and subjective vertigo, at least from the 2-R analysis. I don't get that distinction. Now, they say we're called a liberal humanism concedes the Levinasian shit. Yeah, sure, Anthony, you said Levinas in the 2-R, but I don't think you understand the distinction. We are not a liberal Western mode of ethics, but rather an analysis of ethics that is in relation to a proximate other, which is not something that is necessarily illiberal. It's not sentimental. It is not something that regurgitates a system that is necessarily opposed to anti-blackness, but rather fundamentally questions the norms that ground our presence in the first place. They say the economy of desires, or they say vote negative, refuse hope. Why the fuck is the 1AC not a process of social refusal? Our argument is that yes, we have had a refusal against security studies, but the Jackson evidence makes a claim about how that exists writ large and structurally, which means that you don't get it. They say the ballot argument is a crackdown. You don't answer the relationality argument in the 2-R. Empathy politics is bad. Our argument is that even if they're related, is that if their relation arguments presume that we cannot have a relationship with blackness, that it is necessarily arelational, then I don't think you can either, which puts them in a double bind. Either A, that the argument above is true and you can vote affirmative because you can validate the substance of the 1AC if they're winning not only a relationality argument to this, but also later, but B, also their ontology arguments don't make sense in that context because our analysis would have to presume that everyone as subjects in this space has a particular relationality, which means you cannot validate that shit. Also means that
It also means that if that is true, that you can't validate their shit because there's a specific relationality, then they don't win the ontology arguments because that's what it presumes under.
The next argument is that the 1AC is bad because we are a reinstantiation of ethical America. Our argument is not that, but a rather larger radical transformation that allows us to see that the vertigo debate is problematic because we didn't concede it. It was we didn't concede it. You conceded the McKittrick evidence. Their analysis is completely wrong. The ontological structures of anti-blackness manifest through repetition and consolidation of descriptive statements that form the Western man as the only kind of humanity that creates a risk of an even antagonistic efforts that replicates a conceptual framework that locates blackness outside of humanity. Even though these efforts may then embody resistant forms of life, they have already discursively they've already been discursively colonized by intellectual activity, by rehearsing an existing system of knowledge that posits black people as suffering, dead, and dying, by over-identifying with the structure of anti-blackness as it is currently maintained and maintained. They have conceived the winter evidence that impacts this by saying that it is not man 1 and man 2, it's an over-representation of man that allowed for themselves to subsume and understand the human when 15th and 16th century colonizers decided to justify their actions, to posit themselves at the level of divinity. They ignored the fact that they produced a formulation of rationalism that determined their action, i.e. Slaves were irrational, therefore we could colonize them and take them. That's why the winter evidence flows affirmative, because it begs the underlying normative structure that allows for violence to manifest in the first place. Your particularization of ontology makes it impossible for us to understand that analysis because it views it through a comparative lens rather than a triangularization between things like irrationalism of the Eurocentric periphery, anti-blackness and whiteness, right? All of those exist in triangulation. Your analysis is restricted to a comparative analysis, which is super problematic. Now they say, sorry, bro. I don't really think any of it. So here's the problem with the 2 and R. 2 and R doesn't contextualize any of these arguments. They just kind of make assertions. Zach, I'm going to tell you, read the evidence after this debate because, 1, our evidence is the newest shit that comes from this side of the literature. B, the quote-unquote contextualization of the 2 and R is not our argument. And B, all of your Sexton stuff presumes a social normative structure, which all of our evidence assumes. We've obviously impact turned the concept of not having hope because we say that recognizing blackness as agents allows for, at least in this academic space, not external, to be a productive politics of like subverting a larger anti-black structure, which they have no game on. The permutation viewed as a research strategy has a net benefit of the aft that is just straight fucking dropped in the 2 and R.
Do you need anything?
Yeah, can I get the evidence you read on paper?
This is a pretty enjoyable round. I end up voting negative. I think that the AF isn't really contesting this vertigo argument the way that they need to. Like your argument of you use these examples like there was a black man in the South who didn't realize racism until he was white. That's not really responding to their argument. Vertigo is something that like could happen to a black person at any time, which creates a destabilization effect like internally like upon them. So their argument is that they need to like destabilize the structure that causes that in the first place, or at least that's how your argument comes across to me. I think that this round is like it kind of like becomes closer as the debate goes on because the affirmative team is doing a lot more like analysis of the education. Your 2NR sounds exactly like your 2NC, which is a real problem in this debate because they're like actually citing like the same authors as you and like really attempting to get into this literature. So I think to a certain extent you kind of skated by with this one. So there's a bunch of stuff that I wrote down for notes in terms of like the individual arguments. I'll try to get to each of them specifically. Let's start with the first one. Brock, you can't be indignant when black people say that like slavery was an example of social death based on the fact that they had prayer song. Like that's just like not okay at all. Like yeah, they were able to sing in the fields, but like if the master didn't like their song, then you know literally any form of violence could happen, not only to them but to all the other slaves as well. Which like that aspect of gratuitous violence, I think, is also like an example of an impact that your affirmative like doesn't necessarily access the way that the negative does, because theirs is like operating on the level where it's just like this is that fungibility argument, right? That like any black person will do in a case where like violence by white supremacy needs to be executed. So I think that like there's probably like I think that your Greenwald evidence like opens the door to that, like to operating on the same impact level as them, but I just don't think that like you're really like making any fungibility claims in this specific debate round.
How do you evaluate then the Brown evidence and the Kidrick evidence in relation to the subjective vertigo argument? We made an impact
I'm getting
okay,
there.
super.
Yeah, I got a bunch of notes. Yeah. Yeah. So as far as like the 2NR, like I guess I don't understand this like stick up artist aspect of the alternative. Like it seems like
yeah. It's just like if the stick up artist, i.e. the slave, is like, i.e. the slave can be a stick up artist to the world insofar as like demanding all that it cannot give, i.e. if that is everything, then it was just an argument for how like being a stick up artist to the world is like finding way, like just the link argument means we should just reject the like affirmative. So like not stick up artists to the world in the sense of like we end the world, let's say all together, but rather we should understand the world as coherent. So we're winning link arguments to like relationality.
Yeah, maybe you just need to explain that better or tag it differently. Because like to me, like the concept of the stick up artist is like you put a gun on white supremacy and it's like your money or your life.
Yeah, it's like, I guess we were just like, what does it mean to put a gun to white supremacy? Insofar as like, what does it mean to like indict the?
Yeah, but I mean that doesn't end up being a part of my calculus. It's just something that I thought was interesting. But the dance with death, like evidence that you read, I think is pretty good on that question. Where it's just like there's this like kind of counter invitation from this like non-subjective, from this like object-based place where it's just like you could be like us if you really wanted to, but you choose not to. And I think that aspect of it is really like what ultimately that's part of the thing that turns the tide for me, because when I went back and looked at the evidence there, where is it? The specific, like at the bottom of the Wahilier evidence, it talks about how like the cognitive epistemological intervention by envisioning its own utopia rather than accepting an assigned position within the amelioratory schemes proposed by the dominant discourse. To me, that seems much more like the alternative than your AF, because like I don't understand how your AF is an example of like black people imagining a utopia for themselves, but black people imagining the end of the world, i.e. the end of white supremacy, is an example of that utopia. So I think that's that's a much better example of kind of how they access like an individual solvency argument.
That's like reasonable. My question is do you evaluate then that exact line that you quoted about descriptive statements? I feel like I made it pretty clear in the 1AR or the 2AR that we were impact turning the kind of like descriptive statement of blackness, i.e. the binary imposed comparative analysis between blackness and whiteness being a bad frame.
Yeah, I don't think that the impact of that outweighs like the impact to the negative, though. That you kind of like you make a false promise to blackness that say like, hey, if you were just proximal enough to us and in our Levinasian frame, you could be just like us and like be a real subject. And I think that there's a certain aspect to that where it's just like that is always a false promise because
we have like really good evidence on that. That's why I'm kind of questioning that. It's like I
for
guess
sure,
it's a false promise,
but
it's coming from,
but that also kind of proposes that they don't also have good evidence on it, which I think they do. I think that like, where is it? Yeah, blackness in black people manifests a subjectivity that is akin to the subjectivity of humans. However, it is not human. It is the subjectivity of objects, non-humans, that of the subjunctively imagined commodity. Legal and judicial acts do not absolve or remonstrate the slave of the historical, linguistic, or popular cultural representations. The point I'm getting to with this is that there's an argument made in the 2NR about the accumulation of time as opposed to just like time in the abstract. And so at that point, now that it's 2016, like 400 years of slavery later, like you cannot just like walk into a room and be like, nah, we see you as a proximal other, we Gucci, like that's just not, that's just, well, for sure, like I know that's not what you're saying, but that's how you're being spun by the negative. So like you have, like your spin back has to be less about like, oh, we're impact turning you, and more about like, here's how we solve, because the negative is all about this like presumption thing, and I don't think that you are like really encountering that very much in the 2AR.
Obviously we'll disagree with that, but we don't need to get into
Yeah, of course.
But yeah.
For the on the negative, I'd like to. I think that you need to spend more time, kind of like going through the grammar of suffering arguments that are in the 1NC. I think that like is a much stronger argument to this like ethic of the proximal other than like some of the arguments that you are making, because like if the grammar and language that we use in order to discuss these things are limited by the anti-blackness that is like instituted by this accumulation of time, then how do we recognize who is or is not proximal at that point? So I think that's like kind of another spin you can take to it. This Butler and 15 evidence, like the Black Lives Matter argument, like I think that if you're going to leverage this argument, you need to do it more so, because it does make a claim to like black slaves having some form of humanity. Like it refers to it as like a sliver.
I definitely didn't read the evidence in the 2AC and Brockman.
All right, well then it's not relevant. Sure. I also think that like I think that like maybe like more specificity on like impact turning this like suturing argument. Like maybe instead of suturing bad, you should just flip it. You should flip it on them and be like suturing good, because there are like this Spiller's evidence about how like the flesh is what like humanity or subjecthood is like grafted onto. I think is kind of like there's space in there for you to kind of like flip that on them and be like, no, like all things are sutured on. Like if it's true that all things are sutured onto the flesh, then there's a possibility that like whiteness could like become cognizant of that suturing like in and of itself, because like as opposed to like this like whiteness as the absence of blackness or blackness as the absence of whiteness stuff that they're critiquing, you can be like, no, it's possible, like there is possibility to build a white subject without having to build a without having to base it off of a black object.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I think that that's like a route, like that's a strategic route that I don't think a lot of debaters have kind of pursued in this like frame of argumentation. I also think that like I don't know about this argument. You make an argument in the 2AR that like the affirmative recognizes black people as subjects, and I don't really think that that's responsive to the negatives argument that like society doesn't. But I think that maybe like more like role of the judge arguments in the back half of the debate about why it's not my responsibility to analyze society like and how it impacts this round, and instead to like realize that the four of you as like researchers and scholars are capable of like recognizing that all those things exist outside of this room, but also like having a debate inside this room that is kind of like.
Didn't we make that argument? I like actually have a line that talks about us as pedagogical agents in your role as an educator, and then framing the debate around a particular research strategy that you're valid.
For sure. Let me rephrase that. You need to do more to answer the negatives argument that we cannot escape society at large, because I think that. What? Yeah, exactly. So I think that like maybe just just, I mean, this is mostly true of the 2NR, but also kind of true of the 2AR. Like, the two of you only really, when identifying each other's arguments, refer to like individual pieces of evidence, and I think that just like more specificity as to like when you're making an argument, like which arguments on the flow answer back, because once we get out of the evidence period of this debate, like the debate basically explodes, and like each individual piece of evidence represents like 4 or 5 different arguments, so there's a certain amount of reconstruction that I have to do regardless of like how many arguments are made in order to like coherently make sense of both the affirmative and the negative strategies. So I think that just like more clarity on that from both teams would be good.
Yeah, I was like, I figured like the way I was trying to structure the 2NR is because I thought that 2AR was going to go back to AF. It was going to go back to AF proper.
I don't know. When the 1AR, it's pretty clear that they're going for the impact turn strategy.
But I was like, they can't really just like go for impact turns, can they? And I was like, they have to go for the AF, like somewhat.
I mean, it was pretty strategic. I gotta be honest. It was pretty strategic.
Yeah, I agree. So it was just like a intuitive.
Yeah.
Thing. Yeah.
No, I also think that like the affirmative needs a better response to this kind of like man/human is opposed to nature argument. And I think that this kind of goes back to the question of like who is a subject and who is a object in civil society kind of debate. Like it's kind of like another take on that argument.
So then my question is the top question I had above, which was the McKittrick and Winter evidence and how that implicates this debate. Because I think where we might be disagreeing is I think this argument that you're referencing is answered by the McKittrick evidence. So I'm just curious how you evaluated that in relation to most of these arguments.
Well, McKittrick makes a statement about her book or her article that Black Metamorphosis does not refuse Black humanity as well. And then the last part that you have highlighted that talks about like the affirmation of Black humanness, like it talks about how it's relational, the relational and contradistinct part.
That's the 1AR card, right?
Yeah.
I'm more referencing the 2AC card, the one that says over-identifying Black bodies as separate maintains a biocentric racialization. I feel like all their agency arguments that you're justifying via like the negative ballot via are answered by this McKittrick evidence.
I mean, maybe this card just needs to be explained to me better. Like if there's another time around, because I think that there are like this happens more so like in the as a response to this, but it's not really in the 2NR. But the 1NR response is about how like there is a political schema that dictates agency. It's not just personal agency within the space, like that Anthony and Corey are agents in relation to like they can do things in this space, but in terms of like the political context in which your AF kind of like says we can change the politics of things, I don't think this card answers the question of whether they have agency there. This seems to just this card just like while I'm reading it seems to just kind of talk about how like the bodies them like focusing on the body means that like we can identify people based on their phenotype, and they're already making arguments that say Blackness is not just phenotypical, it's also political.
Yeah.
So I think that just like a better explanation of how this card accesses the structural, and the fact that I thought you were talking about a different McKittrick card on that question also kind of proves the point I made earlier that like more specificity not just to the evidence but to the arguments themselves would be like a valuable strategy, just so that when I'm like putting it together and I look at my 2NR, I'm like the McKittrick evidence, I don't go to the wrong place.
I have a question on like, so the 1AR kind of like pivoted